Rebecca and Kyle Anderson's seemingly perfect suburban life shattered in an instant when an affair, exposed on national television, pushed their marriage to its breaking point. What began as a quiet betrayal spiraled into a devastating tragedy, leaving a once loving husband to make a choice that would change everything forever. Rebecca and Kyle Anderson's life appeared to be the epitome of suburban bliss. They lived in a charming two-story home on a tree-lined street in a quiet neighborhood. From the outside, they had everything anyone could ask for: a successful career, 2 children who excelled in school, and a seemingly happy marriage. Their circle of friends often praised them as the ideal couple, always talking about their shared love for family vacations, community events, and their devotion to one another. Kyle worked long hours at a tech company, but he did it to provide for his family. His job was demanding, but Rebecca, a stay-at-home mom, had always been supportive. She spent her days taking care of the kids, driving them to school and extracurricular activities, and maintaining their home. She prided herself on making sure their lives ran smoothly, keeping everything in order, and supporting her husband when he needed a break from his hectic work schedule. They had a comfortable rhythm, and the kids, Lily, age 6, and Ethan, age 9, thrived in this environment. But as the months passed, Kyle began to notice subtle changes in Rebecca's behavior. It was nothing that he could put his finger on at first, just small shifts in the way she interacted with him. Their conversations seemed less engaged, more surface level. She no longer asked him about his day, nor did she talk about hers with the same enthusiasm. At first he dismissed it. It could have been stress, or perhaps she was just feeling a little overwhelmed with her routine. But as time went on, Kyle's suspicions grew. Rebecca became more distant in the evenings, spending hours on her phone, texting and scrolling through social media in a way she never had before. When Kyle would ask her who she was talking to, she would casually shrug it off or offer vague responses. Her mood seemed to fluctuate from cheerful to agitated, and the warmth that had once characterized their relationship felt absent. She was still there, physically, but mentally it seemed as though she had withdrawn into herself. One night, after a particularly long day at work, Kyle came home to find Rebecca in the living room, staring intently at her phone. She didn't notice him come in, and the screen of her phone turned bright as she tapped away at the screen, absorbed in whatever conversation was taking place. Kyle felt an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. He'd never been the type to invade her privacy, but something inside him told him that something was off. His gut instincts only grew sharper when Rebecca began spending more time away from home. Claiming that she needed some personal time to recharge, she started attending evening yoga classes more frequently, sometimes returning home late into the night, smelling of lavender and sweat. Kyle didn't think much of it at first. After all, Rebecca had always been health-conscious and enjoyed her fitness routine. But as the weeks went by, he started noticing how her excuses began to pile up. She no longer had time for family dinners or even simple chats over coffee in the mornings. It was as if she was slipping away, bit by bit. Kyle tried to confront her about the growing distance between them. But every time he did, Rebecca would brush it off, telling him that he was overthinking things. But Kyle knew better. He could feel the divide, and it was only growing wider with each passing day. What hurt the most was that Rebecca no longer seemed interested in fixing it, as though she had already mentally checked out of the marriage. Still, Kyle couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge the possibility that something was wrong. He loved Rebecca and didn't want to believe that she could be hiding something. But deep down, the nagging feeling that something was amiss lingered, like a dark cloud hovering over their otherwise perfect life. It was a feeling that would soon be impossible to ignore. One evening, Kyle sat down after a long day of work to unwind in front of the TV. He flipped through the channels absent-mindedly, trying to distract himself from the ongoing tension at home. He wasn't even particularly interested in watching anything specific, but when he stumbled across a reality TV show called Truth or Lies, something about it caught his attention. The show featured people confessing secrets on national television, revealing everything from cheating to hidden addictions. The host, a charismatic celebrity known for his no-nonsense approach, guided guests through tough, revealing questions. Kyle had heard about it in passing, but never really paid it much mind. That night, however, something felt different. He lingered on the channel for a few moments, curious about the episode that was airing. The camera zoomed in on a woman sitting across from the host, her face looking both nervous and defiant. As the show's dramatic music played in the background, the host began asking her questions about her marriage. The woman's eyes darted nervously, and she seemed reluctant to answer at first. The tension in the room was palpable. Kyle leaned forward on the couch, his attention suddenly sharpened. As the host probed deeper, he heard the name Rebecca Anderson. His heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he questioned whether he had misheard, but the camera zoomed in on the woman's face, and the truth hit him with the force of a freight train. It was Rebecca, his Rebecca. Before he could even process the shock, the host asked a question that would change everything. "Have you been unfaithful to your husband?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment. Then her voice cracked as she admitted to the affair. Kyle's stomach turned. She spoke about how she had met another man a year ago, someone from her yoga class, and how the relationship had evolved from innocent flirtation to a full-blown affair. She admitted to lying to Kyle, hiding her messages, sneaking around behind his back. She even detailed how the affair had become a significant part of her life, a secret she was no longer able to keep hidden. As Kyle watched, the weight of her words sank in. He was frozen, unable to look away from the screen, even as his world felt like it was unraveling before his eyes. Rebecca's voice trembled as she confessed the hurt she had caused, but it didn't sound like remorse. It sounded like an explanation, a justification. She spoke of feeling neglected in their marriage, of missing the emotional connection she once had with Kyle. The affair, she said, had been her way of finding that missing piece. The more Kyle heard, the more he couldn't believe it. The woman he had loved for years, the woman who had been the mother of his children, was confessing her betrayal on live television. Kyle's mind was overwhelmed with questions. How could she do this? Why didn't she tell him? Why did she let it go on for so long? He couldn't grasp the fact that he was hearing this on a TV show of all places, a reality show that millions of people were watching, just as his wife spoke about the affair with no regard for the damage it would cause. But the show didn't end there. The host pushed her further, asking about the affair's impact on their marriage and the children. Rebecca was candid about the emotional toll the affair had taken on her, but the way she spoke about it made Kyle sick. She didn't seem ashamed. She didn't seem sorry. It was as if the affair had been a solution to her unhappiness rather than the devastating betrayal it truly was. By the time the segment finished, Kyle was no longer sitting on the couch. He was pacing, his mind racing, his chest tight with a mixture of disbelief and anger. The woman on the screen wasn't the wife he had known. This was someone else, someone he didn't recognize, and that realization made him feel more alone than he ever had before. His wife had confessed to the world, had aired their dirty laundry on national TV, and left him to pick up the pieces. The following days after the show aired were a blur of chaos for Kyle. He could barely focus on anything, his mind consumed with the shocking confession he had witnessed. What had once been a marriage built on trust and love now felt like a cruel joke. The anger, confusion, and betrayal swirled inside him, a constant knot in his stomach that he couldn't untangle. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see Rebecca's face on the screen, her words replaying in his head. "I had an affair," she had said it so matter-of-factly, as if it were something she could explain away. But Kyle couldn't understand how she could be so indifferent about something so destructive. Rebecca, however, seemed less affected by the fallout than Kyle had expected. She tried to brush it off in the days that followed, as if the confession had somehow cleared the air between them. She kept apologizing, but the apologies felt hollow. as if she was saying what she thought Kyle wanted to hear. She didn't seem to grasp the depth of his pain. Instead, she talked about how freeing it felt to finally admit the truth, and how maybe, just maybe, this could be a fresh start for them. But to Kyle, this wasn't a fresh start. This was a shattered mirror, a life he could never put back together. The fact that it had all been exposed on national television only made the pain worse. Kyle had never wanted to be the subject of gossip, never wanted his private life to be aired for everyone to see. Yet, there it was, on the front pages of newspapers and spread across social media platforms. His friends, co-workers, and even strangers were commenting on Rebecca's affair, offering their own opinions on what had happened. Some blamed him, saying that he must have done something wrong to drive her away. Others expressed sympathy for Rebecca, saying she had simply fallen into temptation. But to Kyle, it was all noise. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. The only thing that mattered was what had happened between him and Rebecca, and that was a wound he couldn't heal. The children, too, were affected. They were too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, but they knew something was wrong. Lily and Ethan asked why Mommy and Daddy weren't talking to each other anymore, and why they weren't going to family events together like they used to. Kyle couldn't answer them, not without breaking down. He tried to be strong for them, to maintain some sense of normalcy, but it was getting harder with each passing day. He found himself withdrawing, retreating into himself, unsure of how to move forward. Rebecca, on the other hand, seemed to act as though everything would return to normal. She continued seeing the man she had been having the affair with, texting him regularly, and even meeting up with him when she thought Kyle wouldn't notice. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. The subtle looks on her face when she picked up the phone, the late-night absences, the small gestures, it all pointed to the fact that she wasn't even remotely interested in repairing their marriage. For Kyle, this was the ultimate betrayal. The affair was bad enough, but the fact that Rebecca wasn't even trying to fix things, that she was still emotionally involved with another man, was more than he could bear. He felt like an outsider in his own home, a mere bystander in the life he had built with Rebecca. And despite the occasional apology, despite her claims of wanting to make things right, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was simply playing a part, one that no longer included him. In his darker moments, Kyle found himself replaying the words she had spoken on the show, how she had felt neglected, how the affair had been her way of finding solace. He wondered if he had missed something, if he could have done something differently. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't his fault. Rebecca had made a choice, and that choice had led them down a path neither of them could come back from. Yet, despite the clarity of the situation, Kyle couldn't escape the emotional turmoil. The anger built inside him, festering like a wound that refused to heal. Each day, it seemed to grow deeper, harder to control. As the days turned into weeks, Kyle found himself spiraling further into a state of emotional chaos. The once steady, routine life he had built with Rebecca felt like a distant memory, a past life he couldn't return to. And as the distance between them grew, so did the darkness in his heart. The days following Rebecca's continued betrayal seemed to stretch on endlessly for Kyle. The more he observed her indifference toward their marriage, the more desperate he became to regain some semblance of control over his life. It wasn't just that his wife had betrayed him, it was that she had done so in such a public and unapologetic way. The affair, which had once been a secret, had now been broadcasted to the world. It was no longer just a personal wound, it had been weaponized, used as fodder for entertainment on a reality TV show. Kyle's pride had been shattered, and it was almost as if his identity had been taken from him. But it wasn't only the humiliation that gnawed at him, it was the raw, suffocating anger. The type of anger that festered when you felt utterly powerless and betrayed. Kyle had never been a violent man. He wasn't the type to lash out or resort to extreme measures to solve problems. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea of confronting Rebecca consumed him. It wasn't just a confrontation he wanted, it was a resolution. an end to this nightmare that had been consuming his every thought. That evening, as Kyle sat in their quiet living room, something in him snapped. He stared at the phone in his hand, its screen illuminated by a message Rebecca had just sent. She was talking about plans to meet up with her lover again. He'd read the message over and over, each time his heart sinking a little more. He had tried to remain calm. He had tried to reason with himself, convincing himself that his anger was irrational, that things could still be salvaged. But the realization that Rebecca had no intention of stopping the affair crushed any lingering hope. He stood up suddenly, the tension in his muscles building. It was as if a switch had flipped in his mind. The hours of sleepless nights, the weight of constant betrayal, the fear of being utterly alone, it all came to a head. For the first time in weeks, Kyle didn't feel powerless. In fact, he felt a sickening sense of clarity, as if he had finally found a way to take control of his shattered world. It was as though the gun he had bought several days earlier had materialized from the depths of his rage, a tool that could end the chaos once and for all. The decision to buy the weapon had come out of nowhere, a rash impulse that he hadn't shared with anyone. He had never owned a gun before, nor had he ever considered owning one. But after hours of pacing, after feeling like he had no other recourse, he had walked into a store and made the purchase. At the time, it had felt like an abstract solution, something that offered a way to protect himself from the storm raging inside him. But now, as he stood in the living room, the gun felt tangible in his hands, its cold weight grounding him in the harsh reality of what he was considering. He heard the sound of the door opening as Rebecca returned home, her footsteps echoing through the hallway. She seemed oblivious to the tension in the air. It was almost as if everything was normal to her. She was carrying on with her day, oblivious to the growing storm brewing within Kyle. The bitterness he had been harboring for weeks came to a boiling point. The thought that she would still be seeing the other man, still betraying him in every possible way, pushed Kyle's sanity to its limits. He couldn't take it anymore. He felt cornered, overwhelmed by a desire to make the pain stop, to finally have a resolution, one that didn't involve the endless heartache of rejection and betrayal. As Rebecca entered the living room, Kyle was already standing near the door, his hand tight around the grip of the gun. His thoughts were a blur of rage, humiliation, and desperation. He didn't want to hurt her, or so he convinced himself. But deep down, Kyle knew that something inside him had already broken, and there was no turning back now. The once loving husband and father had been replaced by a man who could see no other way out. Rebecca looked at him in confusion, perhaps sensing the tension in the air but unaware of the danger she was walking into. She didn't even flinch as Kyle took a step closer, his mind clouded with a mixture of fury and hopelessness. The man who had once been her partner was no longer the same. The emotional distance that had grown between them had transformed Kyle into something unrecognizable, someone driven not by reason, but by the desperate need to end the torment that had ruled his life for months. The next few moments unfolded in a blur of shocking clarity, and as Kyle raised the gun, he felt the crushing weight of the decision he was about to make. As the events of that night unfolded, time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. The moment Kyle raised the gun, everything around him felt distant, like he was watching his own life from outside his body. His pulse raced, and his thoughts were a tangle of disbelief and inevitability. The man who had been so consumed by anger, humiliation, and heartbreak had taken a step too far. The choice, once made, was irreversible. Rebecca stood in front of him, her eyes wide with confusion. She seemed not to understand the gravity of the situation, still caught in her own world, her thoughts elsewhere. Kyle's hands trembled, the cold metal of the gun heavy in his grip. He could hear her voice, almost as if it was coming from far away, asking what he was doing. But her words barely registered. The betrayal, the months of emotional abandonment, the humiliation on national television, they all built up into a singular, devastating moment. His mind screamed at him to stop, to think, to do anything other than what he was about to do, but the pain was overwhelming. Rebecca took a step toward him, her hands raised in a gesture of calm, but Kyle couldn't move. His body had already made the decision, and the anger clouding his judgment kept him rooted in place. Her figure was like a ghost in the room, someone he once knew, someone he once loved, but no longer recognized. The woman standing before him was not the person he had married. She was a stranger who had torn their world apart, and in that moment she was something far more dangerous than an estranged wife. She was the face of his unrelenting pain. Without thinking, he fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house like a scream, piercing the thick, oppressive silence that had settled between them. For a moment, everything stopped. The reality of what he had just done did not immediately set in. Rebecca collapsed to the floor, her body crumpling in a way that felt surreal, like it was happening in slow motion. The room seemed to shrink around Kyle, and the weight of his actions hit him like a tidal wave. His breath came in ragged gasps as he dropped the gun to the ground, his legs unable to hold him up. He stood there, frozen, unable to process what had just transpired. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction from finally taking control of his shattered life. Instead, there was only the suffocating presence of regret and fear. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, loud and fast, drowning out everything else. He tried to move toward her, but his body betrayed him. He was rooted to the spot, unable to even kneel down beside her. The air in the house grew thick with tension as the minutes dragged on. Rebecca lay still, her breathing shallow and uneven. Kyle could barely comprehend what he was seeing. The woman he had loved, the woman who had once been the center of his world, was lying motionless at his feet. Her affair had taken everything from him. But now, in this moment, it was his own actions that had destroyed what little remained. Neighbors who had heard the gunshot called 911, and within minutes the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder. Kyle, now fully aware of what he had done, could no longer remain in that house. His legs gave way as he stumbled backward, his mind racing for some way to undo the irreversible, but there was none. He had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. Rebecca was dead, and Kyle was arrested on the spot, his hands still trembling from the weight of his decision. The media frenzy that followed was relentless, as the story of a broken man driven to violence by betrayal and humiliation spread across the news. Kyle, once a man who seemed so ordinary, became a cautionary tale. His name was splashed across headlines, his life forever linked to the tragic ending of a marriage that had once seemed perfect. In the courtroom, the prosecution painted Kyle as a man who had lost control in the heat of passion, while his defense attorneys argued that he had been pushed to the brink by his wife's infidelity and the very public humiliation that followed. The trial would go on for months with no clear resolution, but the damage had already been done. Kyle had lost everything: his wife, his children, his freedom, and all that remained was the haunting image of the life he had destroyed with a single, irreversible decision. As for Rebecca, her affair and the subsequent tragedy would never be forgotten. Her story, once that of a woman seeking solace in the arms of another, was now forever tied to the violent end of a marriage that had spiraled into chaos. In the end, the TV show that had exposed her affair had not just ruined her marriage, it had set in motion a series of events that led to a tragic, irreversible conclusion.